Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Iorì wase podcast. My name is Greg Horn, and I'm sitting here with Marc Lalonde, and we're talking about a very difficult conversation, difficult topic today. Last week, it was announced that the remains of 215 children were found at the site of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops, British Columbia. I think throughout the past a week or so since that news broke, there's been a lot of emotion, a lot of anger, a lot of feeling helpless from a lot of people, and of course outrage over this. It's something that we're covering here in Iorì wase. Of course, this did not happen here in Kahnawake, but this is a stark reminder of the horrors that were committed at residential schools, which was a Canadian government initiative and administered by the churches in Canada and at all denominations, Roman Catholic, Protestant, whatever. And that system ran from the late 1800s until 1996. And it's probably the darkest part of Canada's history. And it's something that a lot of people don't know about. Marc, you're from the West Island. You've been working here for about a year now. Before this, how did you know a lot about the residential school?
No,
system?
and it's funny that you mention that and bring it up because we've had this discussion, and I've had this discussion in my house with my children. The thought was that residential schools were boarding schools, and the more we learn about the process, the more we learn about how children were taken from their homes and dropped into schools and left at the mercy of whoever happened to be in charge. And as we're discovering, the people who were in charge of these places didn't seem to have a whole lot of empathy, sympathy, or compassion for children. And the dehumanization of an entire group of people has just been an absolute nightmare and heartbreaking ordeal. Like I can't imagine having my children taken from me and put in a school and maybe never see them again. So just the idea of having to explain to my children that this has happened and it's happened in my lifetime fills me with a sadness I can't really express.
For those of you who are listening who might not know what the residential school system is, in 1890, thereabouts, the Canadian government developed this policy, and which stems from a law from 1857 called the Gradual Civilization Act, which the whole aim was to assimilate Native people, Indigenous people, the first peoples of this land into the non-Native society, to basically take whatever made them as unique Indigenous people, their language, their culture, their way of life, their customs, their traditions, and remove it from them and to make them into good Canadian citizens. And that was the whole purpose of the school, of these school systems, taking children as young as 4 years old from their homes. And the RCMP was charged with taking the children from their communities and bringing them to these residential schools where they were run by the church. In the case of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, it was the Sisters of St. Anne that ran the school. As we as Indigenous people know by hearing the stories from our grandparents, our aunts, our uncles, our parents, our relatives, our friends, hearing these stories, these children have been subjected to untold horrors, from mental, physical, and sexual abuse. Some just never returned home. There's documented deaths of children at residential schools, and now there's proof today of undocumented deaths. And during the history of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which at one point in time was the largest Indian residential school in Canada, there was 50 children who have passed away from 1890 to 1978. But now we know there's at least 215 more students that were not documented. So, there's 250 kids that never returned home. There's 430 parents that never seen their children again and never knew what happened, right? So that's really what I think everybody across Indigenous communities today is feeling, is that these could have been my parents, my grandparents. They could have been me, because the residential school system isn't that far back in Canada's past, with the last one closing in 1996. Right?
1996. We're not talking about 1896. This is 30 years ago.
And I think that's part of the big problem is how it's talked about. It's talked about as if it's in Canada's past, in Canada's distant past. Canada itself is not an old nation. We're talking 1867. And for this policy to exist, and the whole purpose behind it is just horrible. I'm just going to read a quote here from Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, talking about residential schools versus schools on reserve, and day schools is a different thing, part of the same system. But here's what Canada's first Prime Minister had to say. When a school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. He is simply a savage who can read and write. And that's the views of Canada's first Prime Minister towards Indigenous people and towards Indigenous children. That's just deplorable. Right?
It's evil, frankly, is what it is. And as we reconsider a lot of the viewpoints of quote unquote founding fathers of Canada, we have to reconsider the reprehensibility of a lot of what they did. And we're seeing that. We're seeing a movement to correct some of the mistakes of the past. But I would argue that movement isn't fast enough. And I would argue that movement isn't concrete enough, because we've had a discussion over and over in our offices this week about what steps need to be taken to correct, to make sure this never happens again in the history of this country or humanity, frankly. And it would be nice to know that the government has an idea and a way forward, but there's been nothing. There's been little to no concrete action. There's been little to no nothing in the way of movement. And the government is simply saying, we're going to throw money at the problem and get out of the way.
And you were part of a press conference call earlier this week that kind of, with Indigenous Services Minister Marc Miller and Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett, where this subject was brought up.
Sure, it was a very emotional conference call, but it also was enlightening in a couple of respects. The first respect was, it feels to me the government is attempting to scapegoat the church and put the blame on the church, the Sisters of St. Anne, whatever order happened to be running whatever schools at the time. And I feel like that's a little unfair, given this was a government initiative to put Indigenous children in residential schools, to hand off care of these children, our most vulnerable people, to folks who didn't care about them, to folks who were determined to say, what you are is wrong. We're going to make you something else. And that very concept should go against anything that we as Canadians believe in, frankly.
For these ministers to try to wash their hands and saying, well, it wasn't us, it wasn't Canada, it was the church, and the Pope needs to make an apology, the Pope needs to do this, the church needs to do that. But the church itself was just following through on the policy of the government of the day. And that policy lasted until 1996. And it's insane to think of that it was only not that long ago, that 25 years ago, that the last Indian residential school closed. For Canada to say, well, yeah, okay, Canada, we the Harper government apologized in back in 2008. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been launched. There's 94 calls to action. Not much has been done on these calls of action in the time since. I think it's hard to even put into words of how upsetting this is and how pissed off Indigenous people right across Canada and the US are right now. In 2009, the Harper government was asked, and part of the recommendations from Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to pay to have ground penetrating radar done on the site of every Indian residential school. There's 139 Indian residential schools, to find unmarked mass graves. And the Canadian government said no. They weren't going to do it. And this was asked because of all the survivors' testimony before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission about the deaths and the murder that they've seen. And there's anecdotes of priests raping girls, and then those girls getting pregnant, and then those babies being born and then thrown into the furnace. So there's these horror stories, and the government at the time had the opportunity to say, yes, we're going to look into it. We're going to see if these, to vindicate
Sure.
these stories, right? And to now put some fact and truth that's with evidence. And they said no. And then now the Shuswap Nation in BC put the bill to get this done. 215 bodies were found at one school.
Just one.
Yeah. So now,
and that's one burial site. There may be more.
Yeah. We published an article this week through our partnership with the Local Journalism Initiative that says that they're expecting to find more on that site. Right. So that's 215 children that never returned home, and some as young as the age of 3.
Which is heartbreaking and heart-wrenching as a parent, but as a human being, I feel like this is making us reconsider everything that we've ever known. And frankly, if I'm a parent of a kid who went to a residential school and that child never came home, and the Harper government said, you know what? No, we're not going to go looking for these kids. Once more, it dehumanizes those who were there, because there are, as you say, thousands of pieces of testimony about the horrors that went on. And the government said, you know what? We're good. We don't really want to know. So if you're a person whose child went to a residential school and never came home, if you're the parent of a child who went to residential school and did come home, if you went to residential school yourself, it's galling. There's no defense for it. There is no moral leg the government has to stand on here to say, no, we're not going to go looking for all these missing kids.
Canada loves to boast on the international stage about how great a country it is and how great it is to live in Canada, and that they're this great
utopia,
this multicultural utopia where people can live in harmony and all this and that. Well, if you're not an Indigenous person, that might be true.
That might be true.
But for Canada has no more moral high ground. They have no backbone.
They've ceded the moral high ground.
Yeah, I mean,
they can't.
They like to paint this rosy picture that doesn't exist. That's not reality for Indigenous people in Canada. And we've grown up knowing what Canada did to our people and tried to do and continues to try to do. Right now, the Canadian government is appealing a Supreme Court decision against the Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Children's Caring Network, where it's about kids being taken from their community today and being put in care outside of their communities. They're appealing the Supreme Court decision that's telling Canada you have to treat these kids fairly. And that's just the same things that were done 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago are still happening.
And they're still being justified.
Yeah.
And I don't know what world you can live in and say that's a thing that's good. Because when you have an entire community of people to whom these atrocities have been committed, and then we say, you know what? We'll just sweep it under the rug. No problem. Nothing to see here, people. It makes me question everything I've come to know about living in Canada. Put it that way.
This whole discovery last week, though shocking, is no surprise to Indigenous people, right? And I think we've had this discussion in the office and on social media. It's not surprising. It was it's vindication of the oral tradition and the stories that were passed from our grandparents. And this is only 1 or 2 generations away from most people that they've witnessed.
Right. We're not talking about something that's hundreds and hundreds of years in the past. This is 1 or 2 generations old, and that's it.
Yeah. If this was a boarding school for non-Native children and they found an unmarked grave of 215 non-Native kids, how do you think Canada would be reacting right now?
There would be a public inquiry. There would be public outrage. There would be a massive undertaking of reforms, educational and societal.
And possibly a police criminal investigation, because
I think that would be the tip of the iceberg. That would be the very least.
Because the school closed in 1978 and we don't know that, how long this grave was there, so
statute of limitations on homicide doesn't exist.
So
yep.
people that were responsible for this could very well be alive and enjoying their life
and enriching us as a people.
And that's just reprehensible. That is just being allowed to get away.
Reprehensible is exactly the word, and I would say it's I'm disgusted, and it's evil. Frankly, it's evil because you can't do that to kids. The kind of person that would do what is done, what has been done, and what has historically been done, and what has been told to have been done, and what we know has been done to children, you have to be the most evil people on the planet.
A lot of people are, well, it's not the church's fault. It's not just that. It's the individuals within the church that did this. No, the church, as we've seen throughout history and in recent history, the church has become a breeding ground or somehow attracts these people who look like they're nice and good people and they're spreading the word of God and light and love and all that. But at the end of the day, they're monsters and they're molesting and they're murdering children. Yeah. And it's not just happening, didn't just happen in residential schools. It's happened all over the world and
for a millennia.
Yeah. And you just look at, look at the movie Spotlight. And that's about a case that they found in Boston where priests were molesting, and it turned out to be, they thought it was 10, 12 kids, and it turned out it was 100.
It was hundreds of kids.
And then hundreds and hundreds around the world.
And there was a systematic, sort of way the church moved priests around and hid them and protected them and sheltered them and kept them from a public reckoning. And that also is evil. Yeah. And they're monsters.
Yeah, this community has a long and complicated history with the church, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with sooner rather than later. Yes, the church itself here in the community wasn't part of the residential school system, didn't run a residential school or whatever, but the Jesuit order there are no saints.
Nope.
Throughout history, we've called them the Black Robes. The missionaries coming into the Mohawk Valley in the 1500s and 1600s. They were spreading the Bible by force. And, it's not just, oh, yeah, okay, come convert to Christianity. No.
It was convert to Christianity or we'll kill you.
So this community has a long history with the church. The church itself, throughout history, look at the Crusades. They're invading the Middle East to spread
their church, to assimilate the Middle East.
Yeah.
And all through the history, the church has looked to assimilate people. And it's funny because every time we hear about some atrocity being committed in the name of God, if it's the quote unquote right religion, then in Canada we're totally on board with it.
Yeah,
no problem.
Then it's okay. But then if it's
the wrong religion
or the wrong book,
yep, the wrong book, the wrong name for God,
yeah, then it's terrorism.
Exactly.
Right? And they're heathens, and
yep.
And that's a huge problem with, I think, Western society, is their closed-mindedness to quote unquote the other.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets very complicated. And I think Christianity itself needs to open its eyes and realize that it's not the religion of peace and love that it says it is.
Mm-hmm. It's easy demonization of the other. And honestly, the church has made money and made their bones over the years on demonization of the other. Well, do what we tell you to do, or else you're going to go to hell.
Well, and then at the same time, in the late 1400s, the papal bulls that have made terra nullius, those papal bulls enable those of the Catholic faith to go explore the world and take land and resources in the name of God, because, they're not Christian, they're not white, so they're not people. So you can take whatever you want from them. Then that justifies murder and genocide. And then, then that leads to the doctrine of discovery. Then that leads to, in the U.S., manifest destiny, Western expansion. Everything that's been done in the Americas has been done in the name of God.
And on the basis of Western exceptionalism,
yes,
which is a myth. So, yeah.
You have countries like Canada and the U.S. making strong statements on the international stage against other nations who were committing genocide.
But without a moral leg to stand on.
You talk about the genocide in Rwanda. You talk about the genocide in
Armenia.
In Armenia. You talk about the Holocaust, and Canada being and the U.S. being so outraged, while at the same time they've done the same thing, but because it was them doing it, and it was done to expand westward and to unite, it's okay.
This has been a trend throughout history. And if you look back to World War II, you can see parades of people sporting Nazi colors and regalia walking right down the middle of New York City.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even blinked at. So anti-Semitism, demonization of the other, anybody who is not us is bad.
And I mean, as we talk about the events that are happening today, and I don't think there's any answers on how we move forward and how we get past this and get past the anger. And I think that Canada has done the absolute least it could do in addressing this, and that's by ordering that flags be lowered and the half-mast, and that's literally the least that
they could do.
Yeah.
Everything we've seen to this point has been lip service. Yeah. It's all been thoughts and prayers. We're very sad. There's not really much we can do now about it, but we're really sad, and that is frankly poppycock.
Yeah, there's only so much that we as Indigenous people can do. I mean, we're outraged, and something that we've felt for a long time. But now I think some of our non-native friends and those who are just learning about this are getting a rude awakening, and are now hopefully going to be pressing their elected officials into some sort of action.
Right. And it's funny, we had a discussion about this morning in the office. You had mentioned to me a friend of yours had written a very strong letter to his MP. Inspired by that, I wrote a very strong letter to my MP last night. My MP happens to be a liberal. So my thought is that it'll probably be a little bit more well-received than it would be from a conservative. But I think that's the least we as people can do, that we need to write to our elected representatives and say something needs to be done. Something needs to be done right now.
Since the Liberal government's been elected in 2015, Justin Trudeau has said, there's no relationship more important to me than Canada's relationship with Indigenous people. Throughout his tenure, he's shown that that's not true. You look at the drinking water promise that's not fulfilled. You look at all these other things and talking about, reconciliation. For the Canadian government right now, reconciliation is just a buzzword, because there's nothing that they're doing that's concrete, that's taking action. That's what Canada needs to do right now is to make sure that every former residential school site is
excavated,
is surveyed with ground penetrating radar, same as what was done in Kamloops, and to make sure that there's not more mass graves, because we know there's more. And then do whatever it can to find and identify who these children were and give their families closure.
I agree. The process is going to hurt. It's not going to be fun for the government. It's not going to be fun for the Trudeau government. But this is how change gets made. Change has to hurt.
Yes.
It has to hurt. We have to have a day of reckoning where we say, yeah, we were wrong and we need to correct this, and we need to correct it now.
It's part of Canada's history, and it needs to be taught. It needs to be part of core curriculum. People need to know that this is what Canada has done, and not just as an elective in university or whatever. It needs to be
taught as a mandatory course to kids in school.
Yeah, history is never cut and dry. It's never easy. It's never.
And I think that's the important part here. It's not easy.
Yeah, and so this is dirty. This is ugly. This is painful. This is hurtful. But it's history, and it needs to be taught, and more than just in Indigenous communities. Like it needs to be out there.
It needs to be taught, because what's the old saying, that those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, and we can't repeat this. We can't. We need to do better.
Yeah.
As a country, we need to do better. And frankly, one kid lost is too many kids lost.
There's estimates that as many as 6,000 children died in residential school, and that's 6,000 people that didn't have the opportunity to have kids of their own. And
12,000 parents who didn't get closure. And you're talking about, again, hundreds and hundreds of communities who lost an entire generation of people.
Part of the residential school system was the goal was the eradication of our languages and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that was also part of the Indian day school
Mm-hmm.
system, which is part and parcel of the Indian residential school system, which and the day schools existed in Ganawagi until 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the schools in the community were run by the community, teaching children in Mohawk because that was our primary language.
Mm-hmm.
And then the day school started, operated by the Sisters of St. Anne, and their goal and their mandate was Canadianize us, right?
Assimilate.
And corporal punishment was used, for people speaking their language, and then they were so efficient with it that we have whole generations that consciously didn't teach their children
Their
Mohawk
language. Yeah.
because they didn't want them to be beaten in school. That's why my parents don't speak Mohawk.
Right.
Their parents made a conscious choice not to teach them the language because they didn't want them to suffer the same as they did, going to school. So, this is just something that's just reprehensible, right? And as we go through, society today, starting in the 30, 40 years ago, there's been a movement in our community to reclaim our education system and then reclaim our language and culture and teach our language and culture in schools and go beyond that and to start having Mohawk speakers again and people learning the language. And I think our community can be an example of taking over our education and bringing our language back from the brink, right?
And I would argue it makes Ganawagi a richer community as a result. I think in the last 20 years, we have come to realize that diversity of language, diversity of opinion, diversity of culture is not a bad thing, but rather an asset.
I was a part of the first Mohawk immersion program to go right from nursery right through grade 6. And that was as a community to establish that program was a struggle because it's still part of the Indian day school at the time, that system. And, there was no funding for it. There was no, they said, the government said, you want to do that? You want to have a Mohawk immersion? You're not getting special funding for it.
Well, exactly. And that speaks to, it was the right thing to do, but it was a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
And that speaks to what the government needs to be doing now on reconciliation. We need to be doing the hard things. We need to concretely, there needs to be steps taken, like Quebec has done to protect the French language and culture with laws and restrictions of all kinds. My feeling is it might benefit Canada to protect Indigenous languages and
Canada
cultures.
does have now, under this government, the Indigenous Languages Act that they passed, but
it's toothless.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing that has been done
more lip
concrete.
service.
And I think, we talk about reconciliation and what does reconciliation mean? And I think for this government, reconciliation is just a buzzword. It's not an actual thing. It's something that's not tangible to them and something that they don't really understand. And reconciliation, it's not for us. It's for the government and for Canadians to reconcile with themselves what
they did,
what was done in their name to Indigenous people, and how do they move forward, and they can do reconciliation and move forward in a positive way, and to treat Indigenous people as people, then we're moving forward.
I agree with that. And I think there are individuals within the government now who mean well in that regard. I think there are individuals working in the Ministry of Indigenous Services and Indigenous Affairs Canada that mean well. But to this point, the institution that is the government of Canada has done next to nothing. And reconciliation is effectively a word they use to describe how they administer and manage First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities in Canada.
Reconciliation, as Justin Trudeau put it, is hard work, but it's hard work for Canada.
For Canada.
And they need to do things that are concrete that will make things better. And again, actions speak louder than words and gestures.
And we have only seen words and gestures to this point. Reconciliation means actually doing things, and we haven't seen much done.
I mean, I think there's so much more that can be said, but I think right now we'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any final thoughts?
I would love for the federal government to formulate something in the next week or so that concretely addresses this situation and concretely addresses this problem. I'm not hopeful on that because the wheels of government move very slowly, which is another huge problem. But I do know that my eyes are more open this week than they were last. And I know that my children's eyes are more open this week than last. And I know for a lot of non-Indigenous people in Canada, their eyes are more open this week than last. And I think that is a step in the right direction.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And remember, every child matters.